It's day 9 at sea. It's 985 AD, and you have not seen land since the coast of Norway disappeared behind you over a week ago. There is no compass, because the magnetic compass won't reach Europe for another 200 years. There is no map, because nobody has ever drawn one of this ocean. You might be one of the first humans to ever sail this specific stretch of water. There is no radio, no GPS, no way to call for help, and for the last 2 days, thick cloud cover has hidden the sun completely. You are in an open wooden boat on the North Atlantic with 40 other people, a hold full of salted fish and livestock, and genuinely no modern reference point for figuring out which direction is which. And you are not panicking, because someone on this boat, probably several people, has done this before, and they have a system, not a guess, not a prayer, an actual, repeatable method for figuring out roughly where you are and which way to point the bow, built entirely from paying close attention to the sky, the water, and the birds for generations. Here's the number that should stop you. The Norse didn't just sail along coastlines where they could hug the shore and never lose sight of land, the safe way everyone else in medieval Europe was still sailing. They deliberately launched out into open ocean, out of sight of land for a week or more at a stretch, and used it to find and settle Iceland, then Greenland, and then, genuinely, verifiably, a landmass we now call Newfoundland, 500 years before Columbus. Nobody else in Europe was doing this, not because nobody else wanted new land, because nobody else had figured out how to navigate without a coastline to follow. So today, we're going through exactly how they did it. The sun, the birds, a legendary crystal that historians argued about for a century, the food math of feeding 40 people for weeks with no refrigeration, and what happened on the boats that got it wrong. And by the end, you're going to understand that Viking luck finding all that land wasn't luck at all. It was one of the most underrated scientific achievements of the medieval world. Let's go. Here's the misconception. We picture the Viking longship as a raiding machine. Fast, aggressive, built for hit-and-run attacks on English monasteries. That's true, but it's only half the ship's actual job. The same hull design that made longships fast and shallow enough to raid rivers also made them genuinely dangerous for long ocean crossings. Low sides, open decks, no cabin, completely exposed to North Atlantic weather. And yet, the Norse used a related but distinct ship type, the nar, a wider, deeper cargo vessel, to deliberately cross open ocean carrying entire families, livestock, and everything needed to start a new settlement. That's not a raiding party. That's a colonization program, run on a boat with no engine, no compass, and no charts, across some of the roughest water on the planet. To pull that off intentionally, again and again, for over a century of successful voyages, you need navigation. Real navigation. Let's get into it. Here's the baseline method, and it's simpler than you'd expect, but requires genuine skill to use well. During daylight, the sun's position relative to the horizon tells you direction. It rises roughly in the east, sets roughly in the west, and at local noon, it sits at its highest point, roughly toward the south, from a northern hemisphere vantage point. A skilled Norse navigator tracked the sun's arc across the sky throughout the day and used it, combined with knowledge of the season and how high the sun should sit at a given time of year, at a given latitude, to hold a consistent heading for days at a time. There's a specific tool that may have supported this. A solar shadow board, sometimes called a sun board or bearing dial, essentially a disk with a central peg that casts a shadow. A fragment matching this kind of device was found at a Norse site in Greenland, and the theory is that a navigator could mark where the shadow's tip fell at local noon on a known heading, then use that mark on subsequent days to check if they were still tracking correctly, adjusting course to keep the shadow landing in the same place. It's not GPS precision. It doesn't need to be. If you're aiming for something as large as Iceland or the entire coast of Greenland, you have real margin for error. You just need to hold a roughly consistent heading for a week or two, not hit a single-mile target. Here's the part that historians spent a century arguing about, and it's finally been taken seriously because of actual physics. Norse sagas mention a sunstone, solarstein, used to locate the sun's position even through fog or cloud cover, exactly the situation that would otherwise blind a sun-based navigation system. For a long time, this was treated as folklore, a magical object with no real basis. Then researchers started testing calcite crystals, specifically Iceland spar, a naturally occurring geologically common crystal in Iceland and Scandinavia, and found that calcite is birefringent, meaning it splits light into two polarized beams. Held up and rotated against an overcast sky, the relative brightness of those two beams shifts in a way that can reveal the sun's position even when the sun itself is completely invisible behind cloud, because sunlight scattered through clouds retains a polarization pattern the crystal can detect. Experimental archaeology tests, actual reconstructed voyages and controlled trials have shown this method can locate the sun's bearing to within a few degrees under real overcast Atlantic sky conditions. Nobody has found a sunstone confirmed beyond doubt in a Viking ship burial with an unambiguous label reading "Navigation Crystal." So this remains an area of real, ongoing archaeological debate rather than settled fact. But the physics checks out, the raw material was locally available, and the saga references line up suspiciously well with what a working sunstone would actually do. This is one of the rare cases in history where the folklore might have been describing real, functioning technology the whole time. Here's a method that required zero instruments at all, just close observation, and it's recorded directly in the sagas as a deliberate technique. The Landnámabók, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, describes a navigator named Floki Vilgerdarson deliberately carrying ravens on his ship specifically to help locate land. The method: release a raven mid-ocean. If it flies back toward the ship, there's no land close enough in any direction worth investigating, and the bird returns because it has nowhere better to go. If it flies off in a specific direction and doesn't come back, it has spotted land closer than the ship can see and is heading straight for it. Follow that heading. This works because of something true about most land-seeking birds. They can spot coastlines, cliffs, and vegetation from far higher up and far further away than a human standing on a ship's deck ever could. A raven's eye view effectively multiplied the crew's visual range by using an animal's superior eyesight and altitude as an extension of the ship's own senses. Beyond deliberately carried ravens, sailors also learned to read the general presence and flight direction of coastal seabirds throughout a voyage. Certain species rarely fly far from land, so spotting them at all was itself a piece of navigational information, regardless of which direction they were headed. Beyond sun and birds, experienced Norse sailors were reading the water and the sky as a continuous source of information, in ways that take years to develop and are almost invisible to an untrained eye. Wave patterns change measurably near landmasses. Swells reflect and refract off coastlines and shallow underwater terrain in patterns that a sufficiently experienced sailor can feel through the hull long before land is visible, a skill that Pacific Island navigators developed into an extraordinarily precise science, and that North Atlantic sailors used in a comparable, if less formally documented, way. Cloud formations frequently sit differently over land masses than over open water. A stationary cloud bank on an otherwise clear horizon is a classic sign of land underneath it, since land heats and cools faster than ocean water and creates locally distinct air currents. Water color and clarity shift near coastlines due to sediment, and the temperature of the water itself changes as you cross different currents. Information a barefoot or hands-in-the-water crew could genuinely feel and use to estimate position relative to known currents like those flowing past Iceland and Greenland. None of this was written down as a formal manual. It was accumulated, tested, and passed down the way all Norse practical knowledge was passed down, orally, from an experienced navigator to an apprentice, verified the hard way across dozens of real voyages, exactly like the midwife's knowledge or the exact turf roof thickness that kept a longhouse warm. Here's the part that gets ignored in almost every retelling. Navigation gets you there, but you also have to not starve or die of thirst for the 2 to 4 weeks a crossing to Greenland or beyond could take. Ships carried dried and salted provisions almost exclusively. The same stockfish and skyer we've talked about surviving Norse winters were exactly what got loaded onto a nar for an ocean crossing, because they were already engineered to survive long storage without refrigeration. Fresh water was the harder problem, carried in wooden casks that could spoil or leak, rationed carefully, and supplemented whenever possible by rainwater collection during Atlantic storms, which is a genuinely dangerous trade-off. The same weather that threatens to sink your open boat is also your best chance to refill your water supply. Livestock, sheep, goats, sometimes cattle, were carried live on these voyages specifically because a live animal is a self-preserving food source that doesn't spoil the way stored meat eventually does, at the cost of needing its own fresh water and space on an already cramped boat. Every one of these decisions was a direct trade-off between weight, spoilage risk, and calories, made by people who'd already lost ships and crews to getting that math wrong. And it did go wrong, regularly, because open ocean navigation without instruments has a real failure rate even when you're doing everything right. Sagas and later historical records describe ships blown off course by storms that could last days, sometimes ending up hundreds of miles from their intended destination, which is, in fact, exactly how the Norse are believed to have first sighted North America at all. Bjarni Herjolfsson, sailing toward Greenland around 986 AD, was blown off course by bad weather and sighted an unfamiliar, forested coastline he didn't recognize. Land he chose not to land on, but described well enough that Leif Erikson later used that account to deliberately sail there himself. The famous Norse discovery of North America may have started as a navigational failure that someone else turned into a plan. Not every failure ended that well. Ships were lost with no trace, blown into ice fields in the North Atlantic, or simply never arrived, their fate unrecorded because there was no way to know what had happened to them. The Greenland settlements themselves, centuries later, eventually lost regular contact with Norway and Iceland, partly due to the increasing difficulty and danger of the crossing as climate conditions shifted, a slow-motion navigational failure that took generations rather than days. All right, here's where this turns over. We call it Viking luck when we talk about Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland being found. That framing is backwards, and it's worth being precise about why. Luck is a single event you can't repeat. What the Norse had was a system: sun position, a possible polarized light crystal, bird release protocol, wave reading, cloud reading, current reading, layered together and cross-checked against each other, refined across generations of sailors who died learning what didn't work, so the ones who came after didn't have to relearn it. That's not luck. That's the exact same process as the turf roof thickness in a longhouse, or the midwife's accumulated birth knowledge, or the desert wind catcher angle in ancient Egypt. It's empirical science, run without the word science, without written journals in most cases, refined the only way available to a pre-instrument society. Try it, survive or don't, and pass down whatever worked to the next generation. The reason nobody else in medieval Europe found Greenland or North America first isn't that nobody else wanted to. It's that nobody else had built this specific stack of techniques tested across enough real ocean crossings to make deliberately losing sight of land survivable often enough to be worth trying again. Here's what I keep coming back to. There is a nar somewhere in the North Atlantic, day 9, no coastline in sight, thick cloud overhead. Someone rotates a small crystal against the gray sky and reads a pattern of light the rest of the crew can't even see. Someone else releases a raven and watches which way it doesn't come back. Someone runs a hand through the water over the side and notices it's a few degrees colder than yesterday, which means something specific about where the current has carried them overnight. Not one part of that requires an engine, a satellite, or a screen. It requires attention, memory, and a system built by people who'd already made every mistake this ocean has to offer, and were determined that the next crew wouldn't have to make it again. We now cross oceans by air in a few hours, with a screen showing our exact position at all times, and most of us couldn't tell you which direction is north without checking our phone. The Norse crossed the same ocean in open wooden boats using a sunboard, a crystal, and a bird, and found 3 new land masses doing it. Worth sitting with next time your GPS glitches for 30 seconds and it feels like an emergency. So, if you were on that boat, day 9, no land in sight, which of these methods would you trust the most? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.